We are on to week 16, the semifinals of the fantasy playoffs. So congratulations to all of you who have made it this far. But now your bench spots are very, very important as you try to win your fantasy leagues, and beating the waiver wire just a week early could be the difference between making and winning the championship versus getting booted. So let's take a look at some waiver ads this week that could pay off next week in the championship, starting first with a collection of potential quarterbacks that could be streamers in week 17. I will first begin with a reminder about Bryce Young, who does play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers next week for the championship. And if you remember, Bryce Young put up 300 yards and a touchdown and also rushed for a touchdown on the Buccaneers just a couple weeks ago for nearly 23 fantasy points. Look, I get it. It is Bryce Young at the end of the day, but if you are someone who just lost Patrick Mahomes to injury, or you've been riding Russell Wilson, who isn't doing well without Pickens, or survived somehow this week with Jameis, who now be getting benched, or have been starting Cooper Rush, who's been great, but he's getting Philly in week 17 and will 100% be a sit, I am sure that there is somebody out there watching this right now that Bryce Young will be your starter next week for the championship. Now, number 2 is also a repeat from last week, and not to say that I was right, but I did recommend adding Mason Rudolph last week, and now it looks like he's probably the starter for Tennessee moving forward because, well, Will Levis sucks. So Tennessee does get Jacksonville in week 17, who are currently right now the worst defense against opposing quarterbacks, and just let Aaron Rodgers drop 30 fantasy points on them. And again, in 3 starts for Will Levis this year, Rudolph put up 9, 19, and 17 fantasy points, throwing for over 240 yards in 2 of those games, accounting for 2 touchdowns in 2 of those games as well. And in essentially a quarter and a half of play this weekend, Rudolph put up 200 yards and 2 touchdowns against a soft Bengals defense. So if he is the starter for week 17 against Jacksonville, he is not a terrible Hail Mary option if you really need to start at quarterback. Now, after Young and Rudolph, there really aren't any fantastic streaming options for next week that are just readily available on waivers. I would recommend checking your waiver wire for either Bo Nix or CJ Stroud, as both of them are still available in a roughly 20 to 25% of ESPN fantasy leagues at the time of recording this. Both of those quarterbacks do get great matchups against the Bengals and the Ravens that could be huge scoring weeks against poor passing defenses. And finally, I would also check for Anthony Richardson. Yes, I understand the absolute roller coaster that's been the Anthony Richardson 2024 season, but he does get the New York Giants in week 17, who just got absolutely dunked on by Lamar this past weekend, and has also allowed many 20-plus point weeks to quarterbacks this year, guys like Baker Mayfield, Geno Smith, Joe Burrow, and even a 20-point game allowed to Deshaun Watson. So Anthony Richardson may not be the worst start next week if you really need it, especially if you're coming in as an underdog and need a little bit of a ceiling. Now, we do have one wide receiver stash that I'm very interested in this week because of an injury from Sunday, and that is Malik Washington, who could be in line for a much bigger role in the Miami Dolphins offense based on the severity of the injury to Jalen Waddle. Washington led all Dolphins receivers this week in receiving yards, hauling in 5 catches for 52 yards on 6 targets. Now, he was 4th on the team in total targets, but he did make the most of it, and if that usage continues or even grows with Jalen Waddle sidelined, Malik Washington could be a sneaky start during the championship against a currently bottom 10 pass defense of the Cleveland Browns. All right, on to the defenses that you can just pick up and stash for week 17. I'm just going to name every single defense that has a good matchup next week in the order that I would like to play them, and then you can just check your waivers for these teams. So number 1, the LA Chargers get the New England Patriots. Then Chicago gets Seattle, who may not have Geno Smith. Tennessee gets Jacksonville. Vegas gets New Orleans. Miami gets Cleveland. Tampa Bay gets Carolina, New Orleans gets Vegas, and the New York Giants get the Indianapolis Colts. And then I would also check waivers just in case for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I wouldn't actually believe that anyone would drop the Steelers defense because they are fantastic for fantasy football, but maybe someone in your league is crazy. They dropped Pittsburgh because they played Philly this week and then Baltimore this upcoming week, but they get Kansas City in week 17, who may not have Patrick Mahomes. So just in case Pittsburgh got dropped, check your waiver wires for them because I'd like to play them over everybody that I just named, especially if Carson Wentz is the starter. And then, of course, let's end with some potential handcuffs to pick up and stash for next week. And these are going to be deeper names than the usual guys because we had some injuries this past weekend. But of course, if guys like Blake Corum or Ray Davis or Kendre Miller are still available on your waivers, I would 100% pick up those guys. But these other names could be just as intriguing and potentially just one injury away from being a starter in week 17. So number one, DJ Dallas could be the new backup for James Conner after Amari DiMercado went on injured reserve, and then Trey Benson left the game early with an ankle injury. So if James Conner were to get hurt in week 16, Dallas could be the workhorse for Arizona in week 17 against the LA Rams. Now, number two, Dare Ogunbowale should be added as the handcuff to Joe Mixon. Mixon once again flirted with the medical tent this week after a hip drop tackle and was really this close to a massive injury, but he did come back in not too long after and did play the rest of the game. But that injury scare was enough to make me make sure that I had Dare Ogunbowale everywhere that I have Joe Mixon, because we saw Ogunbowale put up 2 straight 14-plus point games with Joe Mixon out. Now, Dameon Pierce could also be an add as well, but he did not get a carry when Joe Mixon is out. Ogunbowale did. So I think Dare is the backup to own in Houston. Number three, Deonta Foreman could be the new handcuff for Jerome Ford now that Nick Chubb is officially out with a broken foot. Then we also have Craig Reynolds is the new RB2 for Detroit with the news of David Montgomery's season-ending knee injury. So if Gibbs were to miss week 17, Reynolds could be in play against the 49ers. And then don't forget about Khalil Herbert as the handcuff to Chase Brown, who's been getting an absolute metric ton of touches recently. But if he were to miss next week, then Khalil Herbert could be the guy for week 17 against the Denver Broncos. So that is it. Make sure that you guys are using those bench spots wisely if you are still alive in the playoffs. Every single one of your bench players should be there for a reason. And if you have no intent to play any of them, or even if your wide receiver 3 were to get hurt and your wide receiver 5 is not going to fill that gap, then drop that wide receiver 5 for someone you might actually play this week or next and go win a championship.